A millionaire had lost his Rolex watch, until a homeless girl found what he had lost. Moved, the millionaire offered her a gift. After the girl's request, the millionaire was completely touched. Millionaire loses his Rolex watch and a street girl finds it. Grateful, he offered her a reward, and what she asked for made him cry a lot. Subscribe for more touching stories on the bustling Fifth Avenue, where skyscrapers kissed the sky and hurried executives walked with their coffees in disposable cups. Sarah observed the world with her big brown eyes. At 10 years old, she already knew every corner, every newsstand, and every street vendor in that area. Her dark, curly hair, although a bit messy, framed a face that still maintained the sweetness of childhood, despite the difficulties she faced daily. On that autumn morning, the wind blew stronger than usual, making the dry leaves dance on the asphalt. Sarah adjusted her worn-out jacket, a gift from a kind lady who always offered her a warm bread roll at the corner bakery. Mrs. Johnson, as she was known, represented one of the few points of light in the girl's lonely life. The day started like so many others. Sarah helped subway goers with information about lines and schedules, received some coins in return, and carefully saved every cent. Her knowledge of the city impressed passers-by, who often didn't imagine that this small girl could be so articulate and helpful. Between one guidance and another, Sarah kept her most precious belongings in a small worn-out backpack. A notebook with yellowed pages where she practiced her writing in her spare time, a blue comb she had received from a neighborhood hairdresser, and an old crumpled photo of her parents, the only memory she kept of them. Loneliness was her most constant companion, but Sarah found comfort in the small gestures of kindness she received from local merchants. At lunchtime, when the avenue's movement reached its peak, Sarah used to sit on the steps of one of the bank branches. From there, she observed the comings and goings of people, imagining their stories, their destinies, their comfortable lives in warm homes. There was no bitterness in her thoughts, just a genuine curiosity about what it would be like to have a place to call her own. It was during one of these observations that something unusual caught her attention. A different shine reflected in her eyes, coming from the ground near one of the avenue's trash cans. Approaching cautiously, Sarah discovered a watch that seemed to have come out of a fairy tale. Golden, studded with small stones that sparkled under the sunlight, with details so delicate that they seemed to have been made by magical hands. Her heart raced as she held that valuable piece. For a brief moment, she imagined how long that watch could feed her, how many days of comfort it could provide. But something stronger than hunger or the desire for a better life spoke louder. Her sense of justice and honesty, values she cultivated even in the most adverse circumstances. Sarah examined the watch carefully, noticing an inscription on the back, "To Richard, with eternal love, Helen." Those engraved words made her heart tighten. It wasn't just a valuable object, it was a demonstration of love, a precious memory that someone surely missed. Determined to find the true owner, Sarah began her mission. She asked the security guards of nearby buildings, street vendors, and store employees if they knew someone named Richard who might have lost a watch. Her search caught the attention of some passers-by who observed her with a mixture of curiosity and distrust. The sun was already beginning to set when Sarah spotted an elegant young man wearing an impeccable suit who seemed to be frantically searching for something on the ground. His face showed worry and irritation as he scoured every inch of the sidewalk. Sarah approached him, holding the watch firmly in her small hands, ready to do the right thing. Little did she know that this moment would completely change the course of her life. Fate, in its mysterious wisdom, had chosen that day to intertwine her story with people who would transform her existence in ways she could never have imagined. Little Sarah, with her unwavering honesty and pure heart, was about to discover that sometimes life's greatest gifts come disguised as challenges. Sarah approached the young man with hesitant steps, the golden watch weighing in her hands much more than its material value suggested. "Excuse me, sir," she said in her soft voice. "Are you by any chance looking for a watch?" The young man, who appeared to be in his mid-20s, turned abruptly. His ice-blue eyes scanned Sarah's small, ragged figure with evident disdain. "Where did you get that?" he bellowed, snatching the watch from Sarah's hands. "You stole it! You must have stolen it!" Gregory Montgomery, son of one of New York City's most influential businessmen, couldn't conceive the idea that a street child could simply have found his father's precious watch. "No, sir." "I found it near the trash can and was looking for the owner to return it," Sarah explained, feeling her heart race at the unfair accusation. Her words, however, seemed to hit a wall of prejudice and arrogance. "Liar!" Gregory shouted, attracting the attention of passers-by. "Guards! Police! Catch this thief!" The echo of his authoritative voice reverberated down the avenue, transforming an act of kindness into a nightmare. Mrs. Johnson, who was watching the scene from her bakery, tried to intervene. "I know this girl, she's honest. She always helps people around here." But her voice was drowned out by the confusion that was forming. 2 private security guards were already approaching, and in the distance the siren of a police car could be heard. Sarah, trembling like a leaf in the wind, remained where she was. Running would confirm a guilt that didn't exist. Her wobbly legs kept her firm, sustained only by the truth she carried in her heart. Silent tears ran down her face, but her gaze conveyed a dignity that contrasted with her simple clothes. "Please, sir," she tried once more. "I just wanted to do the right thing. I saw the inscription for Richard, 'With eternal love, from Helen.' I spent the whole afternoon looking for the owner." Her choked voice carried a sincerity that was beginning to attract compassionate glances from onlookers. The arrival of the police car transformed Fifth Avenue into a small urban theater. The police officers, already instructed by Gregory about the alleged theft attempt, led Sarah to the nearest police station. Throughout the journey, the girl maintained her dignified posture, repeating her version of the facts with a consistency that only the truth possesses. At the police station, the cold and impersonal environment contrasted with the human warmth that Sarah always distributed on the streets. The detective, a middle-aged man with eyes tired of seeing sad stories, listened attentively as she narrated, for the 3rd time, how she had found the watch. It was when Richard Montgomery, Gregory's father, and the true owner of the watch arrived at the police station. Unlike his son, his brown eyes conveyed a wisdom that only years can provide. He observed Sarah's small figure, noticing not only her worn clothes but mainly the dignity in her gaze. "So it was you who found my watch?" he asked, his voice deep but gentle. Sarah nodded, still apprehensive. "And why didn't you sell it? It must be worth more than you've ever seen in your life." Sarah's answer came without hesitation. "Because it wasn't mine, sir. And from the inscription, I realized it was something important to you. It must have been a special gift from Mrs. Helen." Richard's countenance visibly softened. Helen, his late wife, had given him that watch on their last wedding anniversary. It was his most precious memory of her. Gregory, who was watching the scene leaning against the wall, began to feel the first pangs of regret. "I don't want to press charges," Richard declared to the detective. "In fact, I'd like to reward this young lady for her honesty." Turning to Sarah, he asked, "What would you like as a thank you, little one?" Sarah raised her eyes, now shining not with tears, but with a long-dormant hope. Her answer would surprise everyone present, triggering a series of events that no one could have predicted. Fate, in its infinite wisdom, had chosen that moment to weave the first threads of an extraordinary story. The silence in the police station was palpable as Sarah gathered the courage to express her wish. Her small fingers nervously played with the worn hem of her shirt, while her eyes met Richard Montgomery's. "I don't want money, sir," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "What I want most, what I've always wanted," Sarah took a deep breath, gathering all her courage, "is to have a family, a place to call home, someone who truly cares about me." The simplicity and purity of that request hit Richard like a wave of emotion. Gregory, still leaning against the wall, uncrossed his arms, visibly impacted by the unexpected response. The detective, accustomed to the most diverse situations, couldn't contain a moved smile. Richard approached Sarah, kneeling to be at her height. Up close, he could better see the freckles that dotted her nose, the eyes that carried a maturity beyond her years, and mainly the hope that struggled to survive in her gaze. "You know, Sarah," he said, surprising the girl by remembering her name, "sometimes life presents us with opportunities disguised as coincidences. I have a big house with many empty rooms, and maybe—" He paused, carefully choosing his words. "Maybe we could start with a temporary stay, see how things develop." Gregory stepped forward, his expression a mixture of disbelief and protest. "Dad, you can't be serious. We don't know anything about her." "This girl," Richard completed firmly, "who demonstrated more character today than many adults I know." The look he gave his son carried a clear message of reprimand. Sarah could hardly believe what she was hearing. Her eyes darted from Richard to Gregory and then to the detective, as if seeking confirmation that this was real. You're really inviting me to live in your house?" Richard smiled, a smile that reached his eyes and warmed the heart. "Yes, I am. Of course, we'll need to regularize everything legally, but we can start today. What do you say?" The tears that ran down Sarah's face now were of joy. Mrs. Johnson, who had arrived at the police station to defend the girl, watched the scene with misty eyes, silently thanking for this miracle. In the following hours, Richard took care of all the necessary legal procedures for temporary guardianship, promising to return the next day to formalize the situation. The detective, impressed with the turn of events, facilitated the entire process. On the way to the Montgomery mansion in the back seat of Richard's luxurious car, Sarah observed the city through the window. The same streets that once represented her home now seemed different, as if the whole world had changed in a matter of hours. Gregory, sitting in the passenger seat, maintained a silence loaded with disapproval. Now and then, he cast distrustful glances through the rearview mirror, as if Sarah would disappear with all the family's belongings at any moment. When the car finally passed through the gates of the mansion in the Upper East Side, Sarah couldn't contain an exclamation of amazement. The garden was larger than any square where she had ever slept, and the house looked like a palace out of the fairy tales she used to imagine on lonely nights. "Welcome to your new home, Sarah," said Richard, parking the car. "I'll ask Martha, our housekeeper, to prepare one of the guest rooms for you." As they climbed the steps of the main entrance, Sarah held her small backpack firmly, as if it were an anchor that prevented her from floating in this dream. The reality of her new situation was beginning to settle in, bringing with it not only hope but also apprehension. The interior of the mansion was even more impressive than the exterior. Crystals, works of art, elegant furniture, a world completely different from the streets where Sarah had spent the last few years. Martha, a middle-aged lady with a welcoming smile, promptly appeared to receive them. That night, lying on a soft bed for the first time in years, Sarah looked at the ornate ceiling of her new room. The silent tears that wet her pillow were no longer of sadness, but of a complex mixture of emotions that her young heart could barely process. Across the hall, Gregory remained awake, his mind a whirlwind of contradictory thoughts. The presence of that street girl in his house represented a change he wasn't prepared to accept, and in his heart, a plan was beginning to form to ensure that this situation didn't last long. The sun had barely risen when Sarah opened her eyes, momentarily disoriented by the luxurious environment around her. For an instant, she thought she was dreaming, but the soft touch of the Egyptian cotton sheets reminded her of the incredible turn her life had taken. She sat up in the king-size bed, her bare feet touching the Persian rug, a sensation as strange as it was pleasant. With hesitant steps, Sarah explored the room that was now hers. The closet, larger than any space she had ever slept in, was empty except for some new clothes that Martha had provided the night before. In the attached bathroom, the jacuzzi tub looked like a private lake of luxury. Wearing a simple but new outfit, Sarah went downstairs, following the aroma of fresh coffee. In the kitchen, she found Richard reading the newspaper, a steaming cup in front of him. He raised his eyes and smiled warmly. "Good morning, Sarah. Did you sleep well?" The girl nodded, still shy. "Yes, sir. Thank you for everything." Richard gestured for her to sit down. "No, sir, please. You can call me Richard. Now, what would you like to eat? Martha can prepare anything." Sarah's eyes scanned the laden table, stopping at a basket of fresh bread. Can I have a bread roll?" "Of course you can," Richard replied kindly. "You can eat as many as you want." At that moment, Gregory entered the kitchen, already dressed for work at the family office. His cold gaze briefly rested on Sarah before addressing his father. "Good morning, Dad. Can we talk in private?" Richard sighed, anticipating the tenor of the conversation. "Sure, son. Sarah, feel free to help yourself. Martha will help you with anything you need." In the office, Gregory wasted no time. "Dad, you can't be serious about keeping this girl here. We don't know anything about her." Richard listened patiently before responding. "Gregory, I understand your concern, but Sarah needs a chance. Besides, I've already started the process to obtain her temporary legal guardianship. What if she steals something? What if she's dangerous?" Gregory insisted. "Son," Richard spoke firmly, "it was you who unjustly accused her. She proved to be more honest than many. Give her a chance. Frustrated, Gregory left for work, leaving Richard thoughtful. He knew the adaptation wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to help Sarah. Throughout the day, Sarah explored the mansion with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. Each object seemed too valuable to be touched, each room too large to be inhabited. Martha, noticing her discomfort, approached gently. "Darling, how about helping me prepare lunch? That way you'll feel more at home." Sarah readily accepted, happy to have something to do. In the kitchen, while helping to wash the vegetables, she began to open up. "Martha, do you think Richard will really let me stay?" The housekeeper smiled lovingly. "I'm sure he will, dear. Mr. Richard is a man of his word. But remember, this house has its rules and customs. It will take time for you to adapt." In the afternoon, Richard took Sarah shopping for clothes and school supplies. The girl, accustomed to living with the bare minimum, was overwhelmed with so many options. In a department store, she hesitated in front of a simple but pretty dress. Can I try it on?" she asked timidly. Richard smiled. "Of course you can. And if you like it, we'll take it." When Sarah came out of the fitting room, wearing the delicate blue dress, Richard felt a lump in his throat. For a moment, he remembered his late wife and how she always dreamed of having a daughter. Back at the mansion, Sarah found Gregory in the living room. He observed her with a mixture of curiosity and distrust. "So," he began, his voice cold, "it looks like you're going to stay for a while." Sarah nodded, nervous. "I promise not to bother you, Mr. Gregory." Gregory snorted. "Don't call me Mr. And don't think that just because my father took pity on you, you're part of this family. You don't belong here." The words hit Sarah like a punch, but she maintained her composure. "I understand. I just want a chance to have a home." That night in her room, Sarah cried silently. The reality of her situation hit her with full force. She was grateful, but also scared. The luxurious world of the Montgomery family was unknown territory, full of unspoken rules and invisible expectations. Meanwhile, in the room next door, Gregory was planning. He couldn't accept this intruder in his perfect life. He decided he would find a way to prove that Sarah didn't deserve his father's trust, nor a place in that house. The next morning, Sarah woke up determined to prove her worth. She didn't know what the future held, but she was willing to face each challenge with the same courage that kept her alive on the streets of New York. The following weeks brought a completely new routine to the Montgomery mansion. Sarah, determined to prove her worth, woke up early every day, meticulously tidied her room, and offered to help Martha with household chores. The housekeeper, initially reluctant to accept help from a child, soon found herself charmed by the girl's willingness and ability. Richard, observing Sarah's effort, decided it was time to take the next step. On a Saturday morning, he called the girl to his office. "Sarah," he began, his tone gentle, "you've been adapting well, and I think it's time we think about your education. Would you like to start attending school?" Sarah's eyes shone with a mixture of enthusiasm and apprehension. "I'd love to, sir. Richard. But," she hesitated, looking at her hands, "what if I'm not good enough? It's been so long since I've been to school." Richard stood up, walking around the desk to kneel beside Sarah's chair. "Don't worry about that. We'll hire tutors to help you catch up. The important thing is that you want to learn, and that's already half the battle." That afternoon, while Sarah was excitedly browsing through some textbooks Richard had bought, Gregory entered the library. His cold gaze swept over the scene. "So, the charity continues," he commented sarcastically. Sarah looked up, determined not to be intimidated. "It's not charity. I'm working hard to deserve being here." Gregory laughed humorlessly. "Deserve? You think a few weeks of good behavior erase years on the streets? What kind of habits did you bring into this house? What kind of people did you know out there?" Gregory's words hit Sarah like arrows, but she maintained her composure. "I knew good people on the streets. People who helped each other, even when they had nothing, and I learned from them to be grateful for every little thing." The response caught Gregory off guard. For a brief moment, a glimmer of something akin to respect crossed his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by his usual coldness. He left the library without saying anything more, leaving Sarah with a mixture of sadness and determination. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Sarah dove into her studies with a thirst for knowledge that impressed her tutors. Her nights, once spent looking at the stars and dreaming of a better future, were now dedicated to books and lessons. On a particularly hot afternoon, Richard decided to take Sarah for a walk in the garden. As they walked among the carefully cultivated roses, he noticed how the girl had changed. Her cheeks, once thin, now had a healthy glow, and her eyes shone with newfound confidence. "Sarah," he said, stopping near a fountain, "I'm very proud of you. Your dedication to your studies, your kindness to everyone in the house. You've brought new energy to this place." Sarah blushed at the compliment. "Thank you, Richard. I just want to repay everything you've done for me." Richard smiled, but his eyes had a touch of sadness. "You know, Sarah, since my wife passed away, this house lost much of its joy. Gregory closed himself off and I lost myself in work. But having you here, seeing your enthusiasm for life, has been a blessing." Richard's words touched Sarah deeply. She realized that she wasn't the only one being transformed by this new situation. That night during dinner, something unusual happened. Gregory, who usually maintained a cold silence, asked Sarah a question directly. "How were your classes today?" The silence that followed was almost palpable. Sarah, recovering from the surprise, answered cautiously, "They were good. I'm learning about American history. It's fascinating." Gregory nodded almost imperceptibly. "History was always my favorite subject in school." For a brief moment, an unexpected connection formed. Richard observed the scene with a mixture of surprise and hope. Later in her room, Sarah reflected on how her life had changed. The memories of cold nights on the streets of New York seemed distant, but she didn't forget them. Each day in the Montgomery mansion was a reminder of her journey, where she came from and where she could go. In the room next door, Gregory struggled with conflicting feelings. Sarah's presence had awakened emotions he had long tried to suppress. Memories of his mother, of the time when the house was full of laughter. Part of him still resisted the idea of accepting Sarah, but another part, a part that grew each day, was beginning to see the girl in a new light. As the night progressed, the Montgomery mansion fell silent. But beneath the surface, subtle changes were taking place. Sarah, Gregory, and Richard, each in their own way, were being transformed by each other's presence, rediscovering the meaning of family and home. Summer arrived in New York City, bringing with it not only the heat but also an atmosphere of change to the Montgomery mansion. Sarah, now almost 11 years old, had blossomed over the past few months. Her dedication to her studies impressed everyone, and her presence had brought a long-forgotten lightness to the house. On a particularly hot afternoon, Richard decided to show Sarah a part of the mansion she hadn't yet seen, the second floor, where the main bedrooms and some more intimate rooms of the family were located. The girl followed him with curiosity, her eyes absorbing every detail. "This was Helen's room, my wife," said Richard, opening an ornate door. The scent of lavender still lingered in the air, as if time had stopped in that space. Sarah entered timidly, feeling the weight of family history that this room carried. Her eyes were drawn to a shelf where a delicate porcelain vase rested. The vivid colors and intricate design made it a true work of art. Richard, noticing Sarah's interest, approached. "This vase was Helen's treasure," he explained, his voice laden with emotion. "It was a wedding gift from her grandmother. Helen used to say it represented our union, delicate but resilient." Sarah listened attentively, absorbing every word. "Hey, it's beautiful," she whispered, not daring to touch the precious object. At that moment, Gregory appeared at the door of the room. His face, usually impassive, showed a mixture of surprise and discomfort at seeing Sarah there. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice tense. Richard turned, keeping his calm. "I was showing Sarah some parts of the house she hadn't seen yet, including your mother's room." Gregory entered the room, his eyes fixed on the vase. "That vase," he began, his voice choked. "Mom loved to put daisies in it every spring." It was a rare moment of vulnerability from Gregory, and Sarah felt her heart tighten. For the first time, she saw beyond the young man's cold facade, perceiving the pain he carried. "She must have been a very special woman," Sarah said softly. "The vase is beautiful, but I imagine the memories are even more precious." Her words seemed to touch something in Gregory. He looked at Sarah as if really seeing her for the first time. "Yes," he replied, his voice softer than usual. "She was amazing." Richard watched the interaction with a mixture of surprise and hope. It was the first time he had seen Gregory talk about his mother without hostility since Sarah arrived. In the days that followed, a subtle change could be noticed in Gregory's behavior. Although he still maintained a certain distance, his acidic comments towards Sarah decreased. Occasionally, he even joined her and Richard for dinner, something he rarely did before. Sarah, in turn, continued her journey of adaptation and growth. Her grades at school steadily improved, and she began to make friends among her classmates. However, she never forgot her origins, and often asked Richard to make donations to shelters and organizations that helped street children. One night, as Sarah was studying in the library, Gregory entered silently. He stood for a moment, observing her before speaking. "You really like studying, don't you?" Sarah looked up, surprised. "Yes, I do. Each book is like a new adventure for me." Gregory nodded, a slight smile forming on his lips. "You know, I used to be like that too, before everything changed." It was a moment of unexpected connection. Sarah, gathering courage, asked, "Would you like to study with me sometime? Maybe you could help me with history. Richard said it was your favorite subject." For a moment, Gregory seemed to hesitate, but then, to the surprise of both, he replied, Maybe that's not a bad idea." As Gregory left the library, Sarah felt a wave of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the walls separating them were beginning to crumble. Upstairs, Richard was in his office reviewing some documents when his gaze fell on a family photo. In it, he, Helen, and a young Gregory smiled, happy and united, his heart filled with a mixture of longing and hope. Sarah's presence had brought new life to the mansion, and now, slowly, seemed to be helping to heal old wounds. As night fell over New York City, the Montgomery mansion breathed a different atmosphere. The seeds of change had been planted, and although the path was still long, a new family dynamic was beginning to form, uniting past and present in a promise of the future. Autumn arrived, painting the trees in the Montgomery mansion's garden with shades of gold and red. Sarah, now fully integrated into the school routine, spent her afternoons studying in the library or helping Martha with small household tasks. The relationship with Gregory, although still delicate, had improved considerably since the episode in Helen's room. On a particularly busy afternoon, Sarah was helping Martha organize some objects in the mansion's attic. Among dusty boxes and old furniture, the girl found a photo album. Curious, she opened it and found herself looking at images of a happy family, a younger Richard, a beautiful woman who could only be Helen, and a small Gregory smiling without reservation. "What do you have there, dear?" asked Martha, approaching. Sarah showed the album to the housekeeper. "They're photos of Richard's family, and they looked so happy." Martha sighed, a nostalgic look in her eyes. "Ah, yes. Those were wonderful times. Mrs. Helen lit up this house with her joy." As they browsed the album together, Sarah noticed something strange. "Martha, why aren't there any photos of Gregory's mother pregnant? And I don't see any photos of him as a baby." Martha's expression changed subtly, a shadow of concern crossing her face. "Well, dear, some things are too complicated to explain. Perhaps it's better if we put the album away now." Martha's reaction only increased Sarah's curiosity. In the days that followed, she couldn't get that doubt out of her head. She observed Gregory more closely, noticing small details that had gone unnoticed before, how his eyes were different from Richard's, how his skin tone was slightly lighter than his parents' in the photos. One night, during dinner, Sarah couldn't contain her curiosity. "Richard," she began hesitantly, "can I ask you a personal question?" Richard, surprised by the seriousness in Sarah's tone, nodded. "Of course, dear. What do you want to know? Why aren't there any photos of Mrs. Helen pregnant, or of Gregory when he was a baby?" The silence that followed was deafening. Gregory, who was bringing his fork to his mouth, froze in place. Richard visibly paled, his eyes moving nervously between Sarah and his son. Richard stammered, clearly uncomfortable. Gregory stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly on the floor. "That's none of your business," he exclaimed, before leaving the dining room with long strides. Sarah felt her heart sink. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." Richard took a deep breath, composing himself. "It's not your fault, Sarah. There are things in our past that are difficult to explain. Maybe one day we can talk about it, but not now." In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the mansion became tense. Gregory went back to avoiding Sarah, giving her cold looks when their paths crossed. Richard seemed distracted, lost in thought. Sarah felt guilty and confused. She didn't fully understand what had happened, but she knew she had touched on a delicate subject. One night, unable to sleep, she decided to go to the kitchen for a glass of water. In the hallway, she heard voices coming from Richard's office. Normally, she wouldn't listen to other people's conversations, but the urgent tone made her stop. "Dad, we can't continue with this charade." It was Gregory's voice. "Sarah is asking questions. What if she discovers the truth?" "Calm down, son," Richard replied. "Sarah is part of our family now. Maybe it's time we were honest with her." "Honest?" Gregory laughed humorlessly. "And say what? That I was adopted? That my biological parents abandoned me? That everything she sees in this house is a well-constructed lie?" Sarah felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. She moved away silently, her heart pounding in her chest. Back in her room, she curled up in bed, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Suddenly, many things made sense. The lack of baby photos, the tense relationship between Gregory and Richard, the discomfort whenever the subject of family was mentioned. Sarah realized that despite all the differences, she and Gregory had something in common. Both were seeking a place to truly belong. As the night progressed, Sarah made a decision. She wouldn't confront Gregory or Richard with what she had discovered. Instead, she would do her best to show Gregory that family isn't just a matter of blood, but of love and acceptance. In the Montgomery mansion, long-buried secrets were beginning to surface, threatening to shake the foundations of that family. But with them came the opportunity for healing and renewal. Sarah, in her innocence and wisdom, found herself at the center of a complex web of emotions and hidden truths, determined to help those who had taken her in find the path to reconciliation and true love. The weeks that followed Sarah's discovery were marked by a silent tension in the Montgomery mansion. Gregory, even more reserved than usual, spent most of his time away from home, immersed in work. Richard, in turn, seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders, often lost in thought during meals. Sarah, determined not to let the secret she had discovered negatively affect her new family, decided to act. On a Saturday morning, she woke up early and went to the kitchen, where she found Martha already preparing breakfast. "Martha," said Sarah, "can I ask you a favor?" The housekeeper smiled affectionately. "Of course, dear. What do you need?" "I'd like to prepare a special breakfast for Richard and Gregory, something to make them smile." Martha was touched by the girls' initiative. Together, they spent the next hour preparing pancakes, cutting fresh fruit and making orange juice. Sarah insisted on doing most of the work, wanting the gesture to be truly hers. When Richard came down the stairs, he was surprised by the delicious aroma and the carefully set table. Sarah was standing next to the table, a shy smile on her face. "Good morning, Richard," she said. I wanted to do something special for you today." Richard, visibly moved, hugged Sarah. "Thank you, dear, this is wonderful." Gregory, attracted by the noise and smell, entered the dining room. His gaze swept over the laden table before landing on Sarah. For a moment, his expression softened. "You did all this?" he asked, his voice gentler than usual. Sarah nodded. "Yes, with Martha's help. I wanted to do something to thank you for everything you've done for me." The three sat down to eat, and for the first time in weeks, the atmosphere was light. Gregory even complimented the pancakes, making Sarah blush with pride. After breakfast, Richard suggested a walk in the garden. As they walked among the flowers, Sarah gathered courage to speak. "I know I'm not really part of the family," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "but I want you to know that you're very important to me, and that family doesn't have to be just blood." Richard and Gregory exchanged surprised looks. It was Gregory who spoke first, his voice laden with emotion. "Sarah, you heard our conversation that night, didn't you?" The girl nodded, lowering her eyes. "I didn't mean to listen. It was by accident." Richard knelt before her, holding her hands. "Sarah, look at me. You are part of this family no matter what happens. And you're right, family is much more than blood ties." Gregory, surprising everyone, including himself, joined them. I'm sorry for how I've been acting. The truth is that, well, I was adopted as a baby. Helen and Richard gave me a home, love, everything, but I've always been afraid of not being good enough, of not truly belonging. Sarah, with tears in her eyes, spontaneously hugged Gregory. After a moment of hesitation, he returned the hug. "You both belong to this family," said Richard, his voice choked. "Gregory, you have always been and will always be our son. And Sarah, since you arrived, you've brought a light that had long been absent from our lives." At that moment, in the garden of the Montgomery mansion, something fundamentally changed. The barriers that had been erected by years of secrets and fears began to crumble. In the weeks that followed, the family dynamics transformed. Gregory, freed from the weight of his secret, became more open and affectionate. He began to spend more time at home, often helping Sarah with her studies or simply talking about their days. Richard, in turn, felt rejuvenated. He began to share more stories about Helen, showing Sarah and reminding Gregory of the happy moments the family had shared. One afternoon, as Sarah and Gregory were studying in the library, the girl asked a question she had long wanted to ask. "Gregory, have you ever thought about looking for your biological parents?" The young man was silent for a moment before answering. "I have thought about it, yes, but you know, Sarah, I realized I don't need to. I have a family here. Richard and Helen chose me, loved me, and now we have you too." Sarah smiled, feeling a wave of affection for her now older brother. "We're a bit of an unusual family, aren't we?" Gregory laughed, affectionately messing up Sarah's hair. "Yes, we are. And you know what? I wouldn't trade it for anything in this world." As autumn gave way to winter, the Montgomery mansion filled more and more with laughter, lively conversations, and above all, love. Sarah, Gregory, and Richard had found in each other the family that each of them had always dreamed of having. The porcelain vase in Helen's room, once a symbol of painful memories, now shone with fresh new flowers, a silent testimony to the new life blossoming in the house. And although challenges were still to come, everyone knew that together they could face anything. Winter in New York brought with it not only the cold but an atmosphere of renewal to the Montgomery mansion. 6 months had passed since the revelation in the garden, and the transformation in family dynamics was evident to all. On a cold July morning, Sarah woke up with a palpable expectation in the air. Today was her 11th birthday, the first she would celebrate with her new family. As she came down the stairs, she was surprised by an explosion of colors and smiles. "Surprise!" shouted Richard and Gregory in unison. The room was decorated with colorful balloons, a happy birthday banner, and a table full of presents. Sarah was speechless, her eyes welling up with emotion. You remembered," she whispered. Gregory approached, hugging her affectionately. "How could we forget our little sister's birthday?" Breakfast was a celebration in itself. Martha had prepared all of Sarah's favorite dishes, and conversation flowed animatedly between laughter and plans for the day. "Sarah," said Richard, his voice laden with emotion, "we have a special surprise for you today." Intrigued, Sarah followed Richard and Gregory to the office. There on the desk was a set of official documents. With trembling hands, Sarah picked up the papers and read the header, "Adoption request." This means," she stammered, hardly daring to believe. Richard knelt beside her, holding her hands. "Sarah, if you want, we'd like to make it official. We want you to be legally and in our hearts part of this family." The tears Sarah had been holding back finally overflowed. She hugged Richard and Gregory with all the strength she had. Yes, 1,000 times yes. The rest of the day was a whirlwind of emotions and celebrations. Sarah's school friends were invited to a party in the garden, filling the mansion with laughter and games. Gregory, to everyone's surprise, organized an elaborate treasure hunt with clues hidden throughout the property. In the evening, as the last guests were saying goodbye, Sarah found a moment of calm. She went up to the room that had previously belonged to Helen and stopped in front of the porcelain vase. She gently placed a fresh daisy she had picked from the garden. "Thank you," she whispered to the vase, as if speaking to Helen. "Thank you for bringing me to this family." Gregory, who had silently followed her, spoke from the doorway. "You know, I think Mom would love you." Sarah turned, smiling at her brother. "Do you really think so?" "I'm sure," he replied, entering the room. "She always wanted a daughter. And you brought back the joy we lost when she left." The two siblings hugged, sharing a moment of mutual understanding and affection. Later, gathered in the living room, Richard proposed a toast. "To our family," he said, raising his glass. which has grown not in number but in love and understanding. To family, Sarah and Gregory repeated in chorus. As the night progressed, the three talked about the future. Richard spoke about his plans to expand the company's work to include social projects inspired by Sarah's journey. Gregory, in turn, expressed his desire to get more involved with charitable causes, especially those aimed at children in street situations. Sarah, feeling truly at home for the first time in her life, shared her dreams of becoming a teacher one day, to be able to help other children find their way through education. As the conversation flowed, it became clear that Sarah's presence had not only filled a void in the Montgomery family, but also inspired a profound change in each of them. Richard found a new purpose beyond business. Gregory discovered a capacity to love and care that he didn't know he possessed. And Sarah found the home and family she had always dreamed of. When they finally went to bed, Sarah stopped in the hallway, looking at the family portrait that now included her photo. She smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude and happiness. "Good night, family," she whispered, before entering her room. In the Montgomery mansion, the lights went out one by one. The silence of the night enveloped the house, but it was a different silence now, no longer laden with secrets and unspoken sorrows, but full of promises, dreams, and the warmth of a truly united family. Outside, the stars shone over New York City, silent witnesses to an extraordinary journey. A girl from the streets, a young man tormented by secrets, and a lonely father had found each other, and together rediscovered the meaning of family, love, and belonging. And so, in the quietness of the night, the Montgomery mansion breathed peace, ready for the new chapters that the future would certainly bring. A story of redemption, acceptance, and unconditional love had found its happy ending, proving that sometimes the strongest families are those we choose to create.